Hello, I'm Emily, this is my mum, Penny, and we're going to have a chat about plants. Something I've become more interested in this year with house plants and indoor plants for me, but mum's interest has been more garden, so I'll ask her from that perspective. Okay, so when did you first grow an appreciation for plants?
As a child, because my father was very interested in gardening and plants, and he would tell me what plants were, and I always liked flowers, and he would take me to gardens and tell me what the flowers were. So really, from very early on.
Would he sort of, because I've been learning this year with the house plants about like the different families and like what different sort of types of plant like and like the conditions. That's what I've been like, learning about. Did he kind of teach you from a family perspective, or was it a bit more like dot to dot?
Well, I think probably a little bit by osmosis. You learn a little bit by.
So many biology puns are going to be in this interview.
A little bit, but I think not a lot of it, because I've made terrible mistakes, like all gardeners do. You learn, I think, by doing it.
So your appreciation's grown over the years, you'd say?
Oh, definitely, yes. Mm-hmm. And I think if you talk to a lot of gardeners, I know my father was particularly, he wasn't at all interested in gardens, and it isn't until you have your own garden that that you really either do or don't become interested. I think if you're going to become interested, then that's when you tend to, because then you have to do it. Sort of thing.
I guess in a similar way, I don't have a garden of my own, but almost my room has become my garden with like an idea of growing your own jungle inside. And like, I don't know if you have do you have a sort of attachment to particular plants in your garden that you kind of like to check on them daily and see how they're doing? Or
oh yes, yes, definitely. Yes, I mean the roses, I always like to see what the roses are doing. I get upset if they, not flowering, giving me another lot of roses, second flowers, or so. I mean, some of the plants obviously like where they are, and some don't, and then you have to think about where. I'm sort of thinking where I will move things, or how I will reorganise other areas to accommodate things, and that kind of thing.
Sometimes you hear what they, like when you buy the shrub or the starting point, and then you hear what they advise how you should keep it, like what conditions it's like, but sometimes you don't have all of those, they're not available. Exactly. So you're just trying to see what works, and sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't.
And I mean, a year like this year where you had a really, really dry summer, and that's obviously the way we're going. So I think
we should be expecting dry summers. We should be expecting,
and I suppose we're now kind of beginning to look at different plants, and perhaps realise that some of the plants we grew before we're not going to be able to grow possibly in the next few years. I mean, I think there's been for instance a resurgence of interest in planting grasses, which obviously grow in more arid areas, or not all, but some grow in more arid areas.
Sort of points out how you're noticing climate change in your own garden.
Yes,
by only
absolutely.
Being this thing like, the floods are going to come at some point, or it's what works in your garden is changing. And
yes,
I hadn't considered that before. That's quite, I don't know. It's a bit unnerving, really. How does gardening make you feel when you're out doing it?
I enjoy it. It's sort of very peaceful. It just sort of I forget about other things. I don't get out as much as I'd like to, but when I do, I really, I go out thinking I'll spend an hour or so, and I'm there for the rest of the day usually, if I can be.
Kind of get stuck out there.
Yes, and you start doing something. I'm an inveterate potterer, and it's a great potterer's thing, because you start doing one thing and then you see something else that needs doing, and so it's quite moorish in that way.
Did you notice a change in your mood from when you set out to coming back in?
Yes, I think I do. I think I do. It's being outside in the air, and then I suppose you're nurturing something as well in a way. Yes, it definitely does improve my mood.
What recent trends in gardening have appealed to you?
Again, I don't know if it's a trend or a permanent change. It should really be a permanent change, being more aware of the wildlife and looking after the wildlife.
Don't worry so much about trend being temporary, but just what people are doing now.
Yeah. Well, there's more awareness of allowing things to grow a bit more naturally, to look after the wildlife in the garden, both bugs, insects, and as well as small mammals and birds and everything. Whereas I think people used to gardens were sort of kept very, very neatly and tidily, and that's very nice to see a nice tidy garden, but it's not particularly good for the wildlife. So you need a bit of untidiness, and that can be cultivated untidiness. Growing food is again, I think, a trend that's been growing over the last few years. Where I think people have been drawn to the idea of there's quite growth in having allotments and growing vegetables and that kind of thing.
Apparently there's more women that have allotments.
Oh really? Yes.
Yeah, I think like this year it just the balance tipped over, and there's more women that use allotments than men these days.
Actually, that's interesting, because that used to be much of a male thing, wasn't it? That a man went off to his shed at the bottom of his allotment.
Back beans.
Yes.
Man hunt for beans.
Yes, yeah, right. So I think that is, I hadn't really thought about that, but yes, that's interesting, because I think maybe women generally have got more into gardening, and I'm wondering where that trend comes from. It appeals to me, but yes, women earning a living as gardeners, and so I suppose landscape gardening and all that, which perhaps appeals to women. Well, certainly from the kind of design side of things,
I suppose interior, bringing the interiors, but then becoming exteriors. Exterior designer,
in a way, yes, or use of colour and everything. And I mean, obviously there have been famous gardeners in the past, women like Gertrude Jekyll, etc., etc. But I think it probably. I mean, that's very anecdotal, but I suppose it is doesn't surprise me that that's the case.
I feel like there's connections with sort of self-care, but also care for the planet, and sort of a way of trying to nurture not multiple people, including ourselves, in a way, different attitudes towards the earth than has gone before, as you were saying earlier, with keeping gardens super neat and tidy, and not necessarily thinking about how to look after the environment.
Yes.
Or the use of fertilizers in the last century for producing food, and how that's still the case, but it is.
But then again, we're kind of moving away from that as well, because trying to not use fertilizers and not use chemical.
Trying to go
more organic, and the move towards that, which is all to do. Is caught up with care of wildlife and care of ourselves, and not putting things into the soil that you don't know what you're doing long term.
Yeah.